Our scripture this morning is from the book of Hebrews, and it is chapter 13, and I'll be reading the first two verses. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. The word of the Lord. Scripture in the New Testament often refers to passages in the Old Testament, and sometimes sometimes you have no idea what's going on here, and sometimes you don't even notice it. If you're not aware of the way that Scripture works, you don't even notice it. And this morning's passage is one of those passages. Some have entertained angels without knowing it. It is a reference to several instances in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, where people have entertained angels and not been aware that there were angels there. So that's the reference. And there's one passage in particular that we might call iconic. There's a little joke there. That the writer to the Hebrews refers to, and that is in the book of Genesis, where Abraham shows hospitality to three men who come to him. And in the story, Abraham is standing out at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, so it's hot. And off in the distance, he sees three strangers who are coming. People who he doesn't know. And in this tradition, hospitality is crucial. If you are making a journey in the middle of the desert, in the heat of the day, where there aren't a lot of trees around, where there's not a lot of water available, hospitality becomes a matter of life and death. So in the tradition, in Abraham's tradition, there's an ethical obligation that he has to show hospitality to strangers. And the hospitality is lavish. I mean, many of us, I think, have traveled in foreign countries and have received this kind of hospitality. Talasha referred this morning to receiving that kind of hospitality in Switzerland, where there's just this, we're going to give you the best that we have. And so that's what Abraham does. He offers, kills the fatted calf, so to speak, and offers to these guests the best that he has. The best that he can give to them. Now, in Christian tradition, sometimes these three guests are understood to be the Holy Trinity. And you might ask, well, did the writer of Genesis know about the Holy Trinity? And no, of course not. Of course there was not this sort of well-developed Trinitarian theology in the book of Genesis. And that's not quite the way Scripture works. In our modern minds, we try to explain things and fit things in little boxes, but there's more mystery involved. And is this really the Holy Trinity that are coming to Abraham? Well, maybe, and maybe not. There's mystery there. It's left kind of ambiguous. Clearly, these are not ordinary people in the story. Clearly, they're angels, maybe, but who knows? And there are three of them, and what does that mean? So Christians have kind of taken that story and taken the ambiguity of that and reflected on it. There's contemplation. They thought about it. We don't spend so much time trying to explain it. What does this mean, and how can we explain this, and what should we do in light of this? We reflect on it. Over the years, we ponder what it means. And one of the ways that Christians have done this is through the use of icons. See, I told you this was an iconic passage. Maybe the most famous icon in history, the most famous Eastern Orthodox icon, is of this passage. And it's the Holy Trinity. It's an icon of the Holy Trinity. I actually have one here, as you might have guessed. I learned about icons from a member of College Mennonite Church many years ago when she was my teacher in seminary, and that would be Mary Oyer. I had never even considered icons as something that would be important to me or something I might want to engage. But Mary taught me that there might be something there to icons. So I began to look at icons and think about icons, and I have this icon right here, and you probably can't see it very well, and that's all right because I'm going to leave it out here. And so after the service, you can look at it. But the way that icons work is we don't treat them like we do the Grand Canyon. You've heard the stories of the Grand Canyon that the average person spends 10 minutes at the Grand Canyon and leaves and goes on. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. What does that mean? Oh, it means this. Okay, I see what's going on. And done. You look at it. You gaze at it, not just once, but you look at it again and again and again, and you spend time with that, and you reflect on it, and you don't so much think about what it means, but you place yourself in it. It speaks to you in ways that are beyond words. And so I have this in my office, hanging where it's right there on in front of my desk where I can see it. And I'll look at it from time to time, reflect on it, contemplate it, contemplate the Holy Trinity and the significance of the Holy Trinity. And one of the things that emerges when we think about the Holy Trinity is hospitality. Hospitality is a Trinitarian theme. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by hospitality. When we use the word hospitality, we tend to think about having guests coming to our house and showing them hospitality. But I want to broaden that definition a little bit more, especially in a theological or spiritual sense, to talk about hospitality as the giving of ourselves and of our resources for the well-being of others. Much broader definition of hospitality. We might think of hospitality, we might associate that with hospitals. A hospital, a place of care. I was reading a book this week, reading about the bubonic plague in the 14th century, the 1300s, years ago. And one of the author noted that one of the things about the plague is that many people died who wouldn't have had to die. They died because people were afraid and they avoided them. So they did not receive basic care. Not fancy medical care, but just basic care. Somebody to clean up when there was a mess. Somebody to dress their wounds. And so their wounds became infected, and many, many more people died than needed to die. And it reminded me, when I heard that, of stories of Christians in the early centuries. Christians would provide that basic care and were often more likely to survive plagues when they would happen. And those around them, they knew their neighbors and friends and people that were part of their networks, even if they weren't Christians, would benefit from the care of Christians, and they would become more likely to survive plague, simply that basic care. Even if it wasn't in their home, even if they were going someplace else to provide that care, it was hospitality. So there are very different ways, we have different ways of thinking about hospitality. I'm going to put this here. I think that'll be okay. And after the service, you are welcome to look at that. I think I actually might put that in a pew so you don't have to climb the stairs to see that. But I invite you, anybody who wants to come look at that. Look at that icon. And if you want to make an appointment to borrow it for a longer period of time, I welcome you to do that. I think Mennonites are good at hospitality. I think it's one of our charisms. It's one of our gifts. Hospitality. We do hospitality well. It's kind of a part. We're reflexive about it. It's deep in our tradition, in our Anabaptist tradition. And when we ponder what does it mean to be an Anabaptist, maybe hospitality is up there on the list of what it means to be an Anabaptist. Beth and I were in Kansas this week to check in on my father-in-law, on her dad, and we sat around his kitchen table, and right in front of me where I was eating was was an Emma Schrock painting called The Barn Raising. And there was this barn raising. And like an icon, it sort of draws you in to what's going on in that painting. And there are the horses and buggies, and there are people who are on a roof of a framed barn finishing the roof, the barn raising. Well, we know what that means, right? That's an iconic image for us that speaks to us of hospitality, of sharing of our resources for the benefit of others. David Myers, a man named David Myers, former Mennonite pastor who worked for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was here at College Mennonite, I don't know how many years ago it was, and he told the story from when he was working at FEMA. One of his boss, I think, said, FEMA means find every Mennonite available. And I love that. I think that's great, because it says something about it. It says we're good at hospitality, and we're known for it, and we're recognized for it, and that's a gift. And it reminds me of the story, and I've told this story before, and I have a different take on it today. The story of Milt Grundman, who was in the church I pastored in Kansas, and he died in 2008. I actually was at the cemetery and saw his gravestone this week, so I was reminded he died in 2008. So 15 years. But he loved to tell the story of working with Mennonite Disaster Service, of all his work with MDS. He loved to tell these stories. And he had a kind of a high-pitched voice, and so it just echoes in my mind. Beautiful voice. He had a beautiful voice. And he loved to tell the story of going to the Gulf Coast after a hurricane and being asked by the people who were there, why do you do this? Why do you come here to help us? And he would just pause. He'd say that. He'd tell that story, and he would just pause at that point because he loved this. He loved this. And he would respond, and I said, because you are our brother. What a wonderful response. And I've been thinking about that this week in light of the sermon, in light of the Trinity, and in light of a story that I heard, that I read, several weeks ago, and I already have included it. I included it in Barbara Slaugh's memorial service meditation. So some of you have heard this already, so forgive me. But I love this story because it reframes that question for me, that why do you do this question? It's the story of Pachomius and the conversion of Pachomius. Pachomius lived in the early church days, and he was conscripted into the Roman army. He was essentially imprisoned to be a soldier. He was compelled to be a soldier, along with a bunch of other people. He lived in Egypt. They made him be a soldier. He didn't want to be a soldier, but, well, there he was. And they took him to a town some distance from his family, away from his family, and he was imprisoned, essentially, is how the story goes, to be a soldier. And these people came, and they offered hospitality. They came to the prison, and they gave food and care and nurture and support and comfort and aid. And Pachomius is like, who are these people? And why are they showing this kindness, this hospitality to total strangers? And his fellow prisoners told him, well, they are Christians. And they do this for the sake of the God of heaven. When I read that, I think, wow, that is a different answer. That is a different answer than I thought about before. Maybe some of you have thought about hospitality in this way before. For the sake of the God of heaven. I tend to think about hospitality as, well, we do it because Jesus commands us to do it. We do it out of obligation. We do it to make the world a better place. We do it because the church will grow if we show hospitality. We do it because we want to make the world a better place. The answer was not any of those things. It was not a church growth strategy. We simply do it reflexively for the sake of the God of heaven. And I keep thinking about that. What does that mean? I mean, it can mean different things, right? For the sake of the God of heaven. That could mean any number of things. But I think, I've been thinking more lately that it is a kind of prayer. For the sake of the God of heaven. That we do hospitality as a way to pray, as a kind of icon, as a kind of living icon, if you will, a kind of embodied icon. We reflexively show hospitality. When I was in the Philippines, Beth would send me these tapes. We'd have these cassette tapes. Remember cassette tapes? Anybody remember cassette tapes? She would send me these cassette tapes. And I loved to listen to these things, and I would listen to them over and over and over again. And she sent me a cassette tape. This is going to make me emotional, I think. The cassette tape of her family singing. And one of the songs that they sang, the first time I ever heard this song, was I Bind My Heart This Tide. And I was so moved by that song. I think it's my favorite. I think it might be my favorite hymn. I don't know. My favorite hymn always changes from day to day. I don't know about you. But it's a favorite hymn of mine. I bind my heart this tide to the Galilean side, to the wounds of Calvary, to the Christ who died for me. I think maybe that's what it means to show hospitality for the sake of the God of heaven. We bind our hearts to God. We partake in the mystery of the Holy Trinity and the hospitality of the Holy Trinity. Hospitality is part of the character of God, and when we show hospitality, we bind ourselves to God. In binding ourselves to the neighbor far away and the stranger here at hand, we bind ourselves to God. We become one with God. A living icon. And without hospitality, which is part of the character of God, there is no creation. Hospitality is woven into the fabric of creation. And when we show hospitality, we resonate with the way that things truly are, bound to the Creator, bound to the mystery of the Holy Trinity. There is a tradition, and we sang it earlier. Did you hear it? Of referring to Jesus as our host. In some traditions, it's even the bread in the Eucharist and communion is referred to as the host. The host. Jesus is our host. Part of the story of hospitality, maybe the most important part of the story of hospitality, isn't the giving of hospitality, but the receiving of divine hospitality. And when we bind our hearts to God, we do so not just in an act of binding our hearts to our neighbor and showing hospitality, but in receiving God's hospitality. I invite us to turn to that song, and I can't tell you what the number is. 556, and let's sing that together.